They sold her in the snow. Rope at her wrists, sack over her head. 40 people standing in the frozen mud of a Wyoming morning, laughing. She didn't move, didn't bend, didn't give them the collapse they were waiting for. One man at the edge of the crowd stopped laughing. He'd come down the mountain for flour and salt. Simple arithmetic. Get in, get out, get back before the storm sealed the passes. Then he saw her spine straight, unbowed. The posture of someone who had decided somewhere in the dark before this morning that they would not let this be the thing that broke them. $30 hit the wagon board. The crowd went quiet, and somewhere below the Big Horn Range, in a white-painted house on a frozen valley floor, a lamp was already burning in the window of a man who did not let things go. Winter had only just begun. They sold her in the snow. Rope at her wrists, grain sack over her head. 50 people standing in the frozen mud of a Wyoming morning, and she did not move, did not bend, did not give the crowd the collapse they were waiting for. She stood the way someone stands when standing has become a decision rather than a habit, chin up under the burlap, weight distributed, shoulders squared against everything the morning was doing to her. One man at the edge of the crowd stopped laughing. He had come down the mountain for flour and salt. Simple arithmetic. Get in, get out, get back before the storm sealed the passes. He had not come for this. He had not come for the woman on the wagon with the cattleman's rope at her wrists and the auctioneer describing her the way you describe a plow horse. He had not come for the specific sound of 50 people treating someone else's worst morning as entertainment. But he was there, and she was standing straight, and those two facts in combination turned out to be sufficient. His name was Caleb Marsh, 47 years old, former Union Cavalry, 3rd Division. 13 years above the timberline since the winter, his wife May died of a fever while he rode 14 miles for a doctor and came back 5 hours too late. 13 years of choosing the mountain over everything the valley required of him. He had flour to buy. He had a storm coming. He had every reason to turn his horse around and find something else to look at. He didn't turn around. He didn't fully understand why until much later. At the time, all he knew was that his boots were in the frozen mud, and his horse was tied to the nearest post, and he was moving through the crowd toward the wagon, and the woman on the wagon was still standing straight, and something about that specific fact had made turning away feel like a thing he was physically incapable of. The town of Garrett's Crossing, Wyoming territory, smelled like cold smoke and cold mud and the particular desperation that collects wherever men with money make decisions about people without it. November had come down hard off the Big Horn Range, the kind of hard that turned breath into smoke before it left your lips, that froze the wagon ruts into ridges sharp enough to turn an ankle, that reminded you the mountain was indifferent to whatever you had planned for the week. Caleb Marsh rode into it from the North Trail just past 7 in the morning on his chestnut stallion Red, saddlebags heavy with winter pelts beaver mostly, 2 red fox, 1 wolf that had made the mistake of circling his cabin 3 nights running before his patience ran out entirely. He needed flour, salt, nails if Harker's dry goods still carried the right gauge. Then back up the mountain before the weather stacking itself along the western ridge made the high passes into a different kind of problem. Red stopped at the feed store out of 11 years of habit. Before that, in the years when May came down on supply runs with him, she had bought dried apples from the barrel outside the feed store door, a fact the horse had encoded somewhere in whatever horses use for memory, and had never entirely released. Caleb sat in the saddle for a moment, looked at the barrel, looked at the door, looked at the space where May had stood. Then he put his heels to Red's sides, and they continued down the street, toward the sound of 50 people gathered around something they shouldn't have been watching. The crowd had assembled at the open intersection, where the Eastern Freight Road crossed Main Street in Garrett's Crossing's understanding of civic planning. 2 frozen mud tracks meeting in front of a building nobody used anymore. Silas Bowman stood on an old freight wagon, turned on its side in the mud, serving as a platform. Bowman ran the posting board outside the telegraph office and charged a nickel to read notices that were supposed to be public, which told you everything essential about his character and left nothing worth discovering. And beside him on the wagon, tied at the wrists to an iron ring, the woman. The rope was thick cattleman's cord, her hands bound in front of her, wrists together, the rope running from the iron ring with about 8 inches of slack, not enough to raise her arms above her waist, not enough to turn without the rope registering the movement. Over her head, pulled down past her ears, a grain sack. Rough burlap, the kind used to bag oats in bulk. Someone had pulled it over her without any consideration for what was underneath. She was going to be sold. Caleb understood this before Bowman finished his opening remarks. Not processed, not reasoned through. Just known the immediate comprehension of a situation the body registers before the mind finishes assembling the information. And she was standing straight. He might have left. He had left situations before. He was, by any reasonable accounting, a man who had learned the cost of involvement and paid it in a currency that had taken 13 years to partially replete. He had flour to buy. He had weather coming. He had every practical consideration pointing in the same direction. Except she was standing straight. Not defiant, not theatrical. Straight the way you stand when you have been doing it by decision, rather than comfort. When you have made standing straight into a form of information about yourself, that you are offering to the situation whether the situation deserves it or not. He didn't realize he had dismounted until his boots were in the frozen mud. Before Bowman announced the opening bid, he told the crowd that Crawford Dent of the Double D Ranch, the largest single cattle operation in the territory, had not objected to the sale. The name landed on the crowd the way significant names land on people who understand the weight behind them. Two men at the front of the crowd looked at the ground. Caleb was already moving. 13 years since he had needed this town for anything beyond supplies. 13 years of coming down when the cupboards required it, and going back up before the town required anything of him in return. It was an arrangement that had suited everybody, including Garrett's Crossing, which had its own supply of difficult men, and did not particularly need another one. Red stopped at the feed store, and Caleb didn't correct him immediately. The horse had been stopping at the feed store for 11 years. Before that, in the years when May used to come down with him on supply runs, she had always bought dried apples from the barrel outside the feed store door, a fact that Red had encoded somewhere in whatever horses use for memory, and had never entirely released. Caleb sat in the saddle for a moment and looked at the barrel and the door, and the space where May had stood. Then he put his heels to Red's sides and they continued down the street. He didn't count the years anymore. He had stopped counting somewhere around year 7 when counting had stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like arithmetic. And he had never found arithmetic particularly useful for the kinds of things you couldn't measure or correct. The crowd registered before he understood what he was looking at. Sound first, the specific human noise that gathers wherever people have assembled to watch something happen to someone else. Not cruelty, not always. Something closer to the relief of watching misfortune from the outside. 50 people, maybe more, pressing in from the side streets and the alley between the surveyor's office and the Chandlers. They had converged on the open intersection where the Eastern Freight Road crossed Main Street, which in Garrett's Crossing's understanding of civic planning meant 2 frozen mud tracks meeting in front of a building nobody used anymore. Caleb pulled Red to a stop at the edge of the gathering. He looked over the heads of the crowd toward the center of the square. An old freight wagon had been turned on its side in the mud, serving as a platform. Silas Bowman stood on it. Caleb knew Bowman, the way you know certain plants identifiable at a distance, as something that would cause you discomfort if you handled it wrong. Bowman ran the posting board outside the telegraph office and charged a nickel to read notices that were supposed to be public, which told you everything essential about his character, and left nothing worth discovering. He had a sheet of paper in one hand that he was waving like a document of authority he hadn't otherwise earned, and he was using the particular voice men use when they are performing confidence they do not actually possess. And beside him on the wagon, tied at the wrists to an iron ring bolted into the wagon bed, was a woman. The rope was thick cattleman's cord, the kind used for branding work. Her hands were bound in front of her, wrists together, the rope running from the iron ring with about 8 inches of slack, not enough to raise her arms above her waist, not enough to turn without the rope registering the movement. Over her head, pulled down past her ears and resting on her shoulders, a grain sack. Rough burlap, the kind used to bag oats or corn in bulk. Someone had pulled it over her without any consideration for what was underneath. That specific carelessness sat in Caleb's chest in a way he didn't examine too closely. She was going to be sold. He understood this before Bowman finished his opening remarks. The way you understand certain things in the middle of situations not processed, not reasoned through, just known. Her dress had once been blue, the particular blue of good indigo dye bought at a real store, not a trading post. It had faded, and the fabric had a worn quality at the elbows and the hem. But someone had pressed it recently, or tried to, and her boots visible below the hem were old, and the soles were worn thin, but they had been brushed and the leather had been oiled in the last few days. You did not oil your boots before an auction. You oiled your boots because you were the kind of person who oiled your boots. And that kind of person persisted through whatever the current situation required of them. Caleb noticed these things in the order he had always noticed things, the detail that told the story behind the story. A habit from the war that had never gone back to wherever it came from. He might have left. He had left situations before. He was, by any reasonable accounting, a man who had learned the cost of involvement and had paid it fully in a currency that had taken 13 years to partially replete. He had flour to buy. He had weather coming. He had a wolf pelt worth a decent sum and a horse who would behave better on the trail home if they left before dark. Every practical consideration pointed in the same direction. Except the woman on the wagon was standing straight, not defiant, not theatrical, straight the way you stand when you have been doing it by decision rather than by comfort, when you have made standing straight into a form of information about yourself that you are offering to the situation, whether the situation deserves it or not. Her chin was up under the burlap. Her weight was distributed. Her shoulders were neither hunched forward in the posture of someone trying to disappear, nor pulled back in the posture of someone performing dignity for an audience. She was simply standing the way she had apparently decided to stand, and nothing that was happening around her had changed her mind about it yet. Bowman was describing her the way you describe livestock labor capacity, physical condition, estimated age. Around her, men were shouting bids and suggestions that Caleb wasn't going to catalog, because cataloging them would require holding them in his mind, and he had decided against that. The crowd had the density of people who had agreed collectively to treat this as entertainment, and the weight of that agreement pressed down on the intersection like something physical. She did not flinch. He didn't realize he had dismounted until his boots were in the frozen mud. Didn't realize he had tied Red to the nearest hitching post until the leather was already looped and his hands were already free. Didn't realize he was moving through the crowd until he was on the other side of it, standing in the open space in front of the wagon, where the air smelled of coal smoke and cold, and the particular human reality of 50 people gathered close together in November. Bowman saw him and his pitch voice lost a beat. Caleb Marsh, not a greeting, an identification, the way you identify something that has appeared in your field of vision and requires categorizing. Caleb looked at the woman on the wagon, he looked at the rope, he looked at the iron ring, and then he said, "How much?" Not a question. The way you state a number before the other person has decided what it is. Bowman blinked. "Well, we're at 7 right now. Started at 5. There's a gentleman who needs someone for floor work who's offered 7.5, 20. The crowd went quiet. 40-50 people holding their breath produced a specific kind of density in the air, redirected energy, loaded and looking for somewhere to go. Bowman's eyes had the expression of a man running calculations he hadn't expected to be running. $20, Marsh. You haven't even seen her. You don't know what you're 30. Not because anyone had countered, because deliberation was finished. $30, final. I'm buying her labor. The last sentence added for the crowd. For whatever record Bowman thought he was keeping, for the specific legal architecture of a transaction, that Caleb was already not entirely sure he understood his own reasons for entering. He looked at Bowman and felt something cold and clear move through his chest. The crowd was silent in the way crowds go silent when something unexpected has interrupted the entertainment and they haven't yet decided how to resume. No one topped it. Caleb had spent most of his adult life in situations where the question was whether anyone would push back, and he had learned to read the moment when the answer was no. This was that moment. The air had a particular quality of settled things. Bowman grinned the way men grin when they've made unexpected money. He caught the leather pouch Caleb tossed onto the wagon bed and the coins hit with the sound of $30 in silver, sold to the mountain man. Caleb climbed onto the wagon without asking permission. Up close, the rope was worse than it had looked from below. Her wrists were red beneath the cord, the redness that comes from prolonged contact with rough material, not the acute redness of recent tightening. This had been on for a while. He loosened the knot from the iron ring without removing it from her wrists entirely. Not here, not with 50 people watching and his own intentions still too unformed to present to witnesses. He stepped down. She stepped down beside him. Both boots hit the frozen mud at the same moment. They walked out of the square in the direction of the hitching post, without looking back at Bowman, without looking at the crowd, without providing the kind of narrative closure that would have satisfied the spectators. He heard the noise resume behind them, the specific sound of a crowd returning to its own business, once the entertainment has moved elsewhere. He untied Red and led both animals to the livery at the end of Main Street, where he retrieved Dusty from the stall he'd left her in. Dusty was a bay mare he kept for supply runs, 15 years old and getting particular about how she felt about terrain, but with a quality of steadiness that Red, for all his virtues, had never fully developed. He saddled her without much discussion of the situation, which was how he preferred to approach most things. It was 20 minutes before they were out of town. The North Trail climbed immediately out of Garrett's Crossing, up through a stand of scrub cottonwood, and then into the first real timber at about 1,000 feet. The town dropped away behind a ridge, and then it was just trail and cold air, and the sound of 2 horses moving through frozen ground. She rode Dusty without instruction. This registered in a particular way. He'd ridden with people who didn't know horses, the stiffness, the reactive grip, the way the horse reads the uncertainty of the rider and reflects it back. She rode with the weight distribution of someone whose body had done this before, and remembered the conversation without being reminded. Not a girl who had sat on a horse once or twice in her life. Someone who had ridden regularly and recently, though the recently was relative given whatever the preceding weeks or months had contained. He watched this from his peripheral vision and said nothing about it. An hour out of Garrett's Crossing, when the town was behind 2 ridgelines, and the only sounds were wind and hoofbeats, and the occasional crack of a snow-loaded pine bough reaching its limit, Caleb spoke to the trail in front of him. "You can take it off. Nobody's watching." He heard the horses, he heard the wind, he heard her breathing measured, the specific effort of someone maintaining an evenness that does not come without work. 30 seconds passed, then a small sound, the rasp of burlap against her collar. When he glanced back, she had lifted the sack just far enough to see the trail ahead. Not to breathe better, not to look at the sky or take in the landscape or assess her situation in any larger sense, just enough to see the next 20 feet of trail. The minimum required by the present moment and nothing beyond it. The precision of the gesture occupied a specific corner of his attention for the remaining 3 hours of the climb. He turned back to the trail and didn't raise the subject again. The cabin appeared through the pines as the light went flat and gray in the way it goes flat and gray in the hour before dark when clouds diffuse the remaining sun into a general dimness. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees since midday. The structure sat against the north face of a granite shelf, sheltered from the worst of the western wind, close enough to the creek that you could hear the water in spring, far enough from the lower trails that casual visitors had never been a concern. He had built it in 1873 with materials hauled up in 3 loads, and the labor of a Crow trapper named Henry, who had taken payment in 3 good rifles and then not come back, which had been the nature of most of Caleb's arrangements north of the timberline. It was not a beautiful building. It was a building that worked, which he had decided long ago was the more important quality. He dismounted and helped her down from Dusty, a practical matter, given the drop from the stirrup to the frozen ground, not a statement about capacity. She didn't lean into his hands, but she didn't pull away either. Whatever category she had placed him in had not been finalized. He tied both horses to the post beside the door and went inside first to check the coals in the hearth. Still alive. The cabin would warm in 10 minutes with real wood added. He fed the fire before he did anything else, because warmth was the immediate priority and everything else could be sequenced after. She came through the door while he was crouched at the hearth. He heard her stop in the center of the room. He didn't turn around yet. The cabin was one man's logic made physical. Gear along the west wall organized by frequency of use. Pelts along the east wall sorted by condition. a sleeping loft accessible by ladder on the north side, boards worn smooth in the specific places his hands and feet had found over 11 winters. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf running the length of the south wall, holding books and tools, and the occasional object he had kept, for reasons that didn't fully survive examination in daylight. A stone hearth big enough to heat the space and cook on both, which had been the primary design requirement. Everything arranged according to one person's logic. He was aware of this in a new way, standing with his back to the room while the woman stood in the center of it. When he turned around, she was still wearing the sack. The fire had caught on one corner of the burlap and he saw it before she did, just the edge, just the beginning of a brown scorch mark. No flame yet, but headed that direction inside 10 seconds. He crossed the room and said, "Take it off," and then heard immediately how that landed in the silence of a cabin where a woman stood with her hands still loosely bound, and the only light was the fire. So he added, "I won't send you back." She didn't move for a moment, that stretched long enough for the fire to settle in the hearth, and one of the horses to shift outside, and the wind to pick up through the pines on the ridge above. Then her hands came up. Slow, the way you move when you have been bracing against something for a long time and you have made the decision to stop bracing and simply do the next thing. She lifted the sack up and over her head. He had been preparing himself. He had learned in the war and in the long years after it that how you receive information is often more important than the information itself. He had composed his face into the expression of a man ready for whatever the present moment required. He was not, as it turned out, fully prepared. Ruth Hadley had sharp bones in her face, the kind of structure that catches light from 2 directions at once, that would look different at every hour of the day, as the light changed. Her skin was pale in the way of someone who had spent recent months indoors against her nature, and her hair was dark reddish-brown, the color of creek water over iron-bearing rock, braided once and now mostly not, falling loose past her shoulders. Her left eye was clear green, the particular green of shallow water in summer, the color that changes with what's beneath it. Her right eye was dark gray, not blue-gray, not hazel, a settled mineral gray, like granite seen through cloud cover on a flat day, the color of something that has existed for a long time and is not in any hurry. 2 different colors, same face, both watching him with the expression of someone who has spent a long time waiting to see what the person across from them will do next. And there was a scar on her left cheek. It ran from the high point of her cheekbone down to the corner of her jaw in a line that was too straight, too geometrically precise, too deliberate in its arc to have been caused by anything accidental. Caleb had treated knife wounds in the field, had stitched men up in canvas tents by lantern light, with his hands shaking from cold or from something that wasn't cold. He knew the difference between the record of 2 people in violent motion and the record of someone standing still. Someone who had taken their time, someone calm. This scar had been made by someone calm. Her voice, when she spoke, was level in a way that required effort to maintain, and he recognized the effort because he had maintained that same evenness himself in situations that had tested it. "Well, do I look cursed to you?" He moved from the door, not toward her, not retreating, just shifting his weight to a different position. He looked at the scar the way he would look at sign in the snow, reading what it said about the event that produced it. Who cut you? Not a question. He had stopped framing certain things as questions sometime during the war, when the question form gave people an exit he didn't always want to offer. She held his gaze for 1 full second, then "my husband." The word settled into the room and took up space. She sat down in one of the chairs at the table without being invited to, which he registered as the first fully voluntary thing she had done since he'd bought her off a wagon an hour ago, and he sat in the other chair and fed the fire once more, and did nothing with his face that would give her a reason to stop talking. Her name was Ruth Hadley. Her father had been James Hadley, school teacher out of a settlement called Carson Flats, a man who had spent 30 years believing that education was the most permanent thing you could give a person, and had given it to anyone willing to sit still long enough to receive it. Maps were part of the curriculum. So was practical medicine. So was the maintenance and accurate use of a firearm, because James Hadley had taken the view that the world was not arranged to protect the unprepared, and that preparing people was exactly his job. He had died of a lung sickness when Ruth was 20, which had left her in a settlement with more opinions about her options than actual options. Crawford Dent had appeared to be an option. Caleb knew the name the way you know geographic features you've been told to avoid. Double D Ranch sat in the lower valley below the Big Horn, approached the largest single cattle operation in the territory by acreage. The kind of spread that made other ranchers do their arithmetic carefully before deciding whether a dispute was worth pursuing. Crawford Dent was in his early 40s, had been married once before, with results that people in Garrett's Crossing discussed in the careful, vague language reserved for things no one could prove, and had money enough to make that careful language self-sustaining indefinitely. He had married Ruth Hadley 7 months after James Hadley's funeral. Ruth was 20 years old and in possession of her father's library, her father's habits of mind, and approximately nothing else in the material sense. She laid the facts down in their order without editorializing, and Caleb heard all the things she didn't say in the spaces between the things she did say. The marriage had not been a marriage. It had been a transaction executed within the legal architecture of marriage, which Dent had understood entirely and Ruth had understood only after the ceremony was complete. He had not wanted a wife. He had wanted an arrangement with the legal permanence to make itself self-enforcing. She had remained for 14 months, and then she had stopped remaining. The specific mechanism of that stopping she described in a sentence, so compressed it contained almost no air. She had refused him once clearly, in a way that could not be reinterpreted. Dent had waited until the following morning. She was in the kitchen when Eve came in with the knife he kept sharpened for marking cattle. He had cut her face with the same deliberate calm he would have brought to any act of property management. When he was finished, he looked at her and said she should know that no man would want to look at her again. Then he had written letters to the territorial seat, to anyone in Garrett's Crossing who would receive them, and everyone would receive them because he had money, and money is the most effective amplifier for any story a man wants told. His wife had attempted to poison him. His wife had become unstable. His wife had always been strange, which was an easy thing to make people believe about a woman with 2 different colored eyes in a town that treated the unusual as a form of threat. The story had traveled faster than Ruth could have ridden, even if she'd had somewhere to ride to. Caleb sat with this. The fire worked in the hearth. The wind moved through the high timber on the ridge with the sound of something that had been moving for a long time and had no intention of stopping. The horses shifted in the lean-to, and the cabin settled around the heat, the way old buildings settle, creaking slightly, adjusting. Then he said, "He'll come up here." Ruth looked at him without apparent surprise. Crawford Dent doesn't release things he considers his property. Then we make sure he finds something different from what he expects. Caleb crossed to the door, checked the bar, checked the south window. The rifle above the door was loaded. Always loaded, because a rifle you have to load when you need it is furniture, not a weapon. He took the spare from the east wall, a Winchester, reliable, the action smooth from use, and set it on the table between them. Ruth looked at the rifle. Then she looked at him. Something moved across her face that wasn't relief, because relief wasn't structurally available yet, but recognition, the recognition of someone who has been waiting for the floor to give way and has found, unexpectedly, that there is a second floor beneath the first. "You take the loft," he said. "A beat. Then you're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question either. "I've seen worse things than scars." He said it to the window, checking the latch. "And I don't put stock in what other people decide to call a curse." She crossed to the ladder and went up without another word. Caleb settled into the chair by the fire with the Winchester across his knees. He listened to the wind build outside and the horses settle in the lean-to, and the small sounds from the loft that were the sounds of a person arranging themselves in a space that wasn't yet theirs. He did not sleep until well after midnight. The days that followed had texture in a way the cabin had not had in years. 2 people moving through the same space according to different logics, learning each other's patterns the way you learn the grain of wood before you put a tool to it. Ruth moved through the cabin with purpose, not the manufactured purpose of someone performing usefulness, but the purpose of someone for whom doing things correctly was simply how things were done. She cooked the way her father had apparently taught everything, as knowledge, not habit. She reorganized the supply shelf on the east wall, according to a system Caleb couldn't fully decode, but which resulted in his being able to find what he needed without the extra step he hadn't realized he'd always been adding. She mended his torn coat on the second day, sitting by the south window in the flat winter light. with stitches smaller and tighter than his own. He noticed this without commenting on it. She swept. She banked the fire the right way, which meant she'd learned the right way. She sharpened the kitchen knife on the wet stone above the wash basin, with the unhurried concentration of someone who had decided that every tool in reach was going to perform at its best capacity going forward, and there was something in the decision that was about more than the knife. On the fourth afternoon, he came back from checking the north trap line to find her at the south window, with the old Bible from the shelf open in her lap. He'd kept the book for the maps he'd stored inside the back cover, a set of hand-drawn topographic sheets he'd carried since the war, accurate to the elevation and the seasonal creek crossings, more useful than anything the territorial survey had produced. No one had looked at those maps since he'd put them there. There had been no one to look at them. He stopped in the doorway. "You can read those." Ruth looked up. Something moved in her expression that was adjacent to pleasure, but carefully managed. The way you manage things you've been prevented from having for long enough that having them again requires a moment of adjustment. "My father made maps compulsory." Her finger traced a contour line on the upper section of the Big Horn approach. "He said knowing where you stand in relation to everything around you was the most practical form of literacy there is." He was right. She looked up. The firelight was different at this angle, and the scar on her cheek caught it the way healed. Tissue catches light differently than the surrounding skin, not worse. Just different, a record rather than a wound. "He was right about most things," she said. "Which made it worse when I found out what he was wrong about." Caleb sat down across from her. The fire was low and he should have built it up, but he didn't move to do it yet. What was he wrong about? She was quiet for a moment that was not empty. Then, he thought a good education and a clear mind were enough protection against a man who had decided what you were worth before you entered the room. Her finger stopped moving on the map. He'd never met a man like Crawford Dent. Caleb looked at the fire. He thought about the things you couldn't prepare people for no matter how carefully you prepared them. The specific gap between what education could give a person and what certain situations required. He knew that gap from the inside, from a different direction, had known it on a winter night in 1871, when he had ridden 14 miles across frozen ground to get a doctor, and ridden back 5 hours later, to find that 5 hours had been the entire distance between the world with May in it and the world without. He had done everything available to him. He had done the complete inventory of his capabilities, and it had not been enough. And the distance between what he was capable of and what that situation had required was the thing he had never found the bottom of. And the 13 years above the timberline were, among other things, a sustained effort not to encounter that distance again. He did not say any of this. He had not arranged it into words by that particular evening. But he said the part that had been true longest. The mountain doesn't ask you to be enough. It asks you to be careful. Being careful is something I know how to do. Ruth was quiet. Then she said, not as a challenge, careful and present aren't the same thing. He looked at her. She was looking at the maps. The fire needed wood, and neither of them moved to add it. Outside, the storm that had been building along the western ridge since Tuesday finally made its decision. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. The snow started at midday and accelerated into something with velocity and intention, pressing against the windows with a sound like interference, like static. By mid-afternoon, the light had gone entirely gray, and the world beyond the glass had simplified itself down to white and moving white, and the dark shapes of the nearest pines visible only as absence of snow. Caleb spent the afternoon bringing in wood 4 loads, filling the stack inside the door to a height that would last 3 days without going back out. He packed the gap at the base of the south window with a strip of wool blanket. He checked the lean-to roof, found one board that had shifted, reset it before the weight could find the weakness. He was doing the maintenance work of a man who had survived enough winters to treat them with specific respect rather than general preparation. He came out of the lean-to in the early dark with his arms full of split pine and stopped. The snow in front of the cabin had been walked on. Not by him, not recently. He set the wood down slowly and crouched, ignoring the cold working through his right knee, and read the tracks with the attention he had learned to give them in a different kind of situation than this, but the same underlying skill. 3 sets. Horses, not deer. The depth and the shape were wrong for anything without a rider's weight on its back. Heavy animals, shod with care. Not the rangy ironwork of stock that did daily ranch work, but the precise fit of purpose-kept horses, whose maintenance was a professional consideration. The tracks circled the north and east walls in a deliberate arc, close enough to the cabin that one of the animals had placed a hoof within 4 feet of the corner log. Then they departed south toward the lower valley, toward the Double D Ranch, and the man who had apparently already decided that Ruth Hadley's current location was information worth acquiring. Not recent. 2 hours, maybe 2.5, made before the snow had come down hard enough to erase the detail. They had come while the weather was building, when a man would expect the cabin's occupants to be focused inward. They had circled, observed, and departed without approaching the door. Reconnaissance, not impulsive, planned. Caleb stood and looked toward the tree line to the south for long enough that the feeling left his fingers inside his gloves. He thought about what it meant that Crawford Dent had sent men up the mountain within 4 days of Ruth's departure. He thought about what it meant that those men had circled rather than knocked. A man who acted on anger knocked. A man who acted on calculation measured the situation before he committed to it. He went inside. Ruth was at the table with the maps. She had moved to the lower valley section, and her finger was resting on the Double D property boundary when he came through the door. She looked at his face before he said anything and set the maps down without being asked. 3 sets of tracks, he said. They circled the cabin and went back south. She absorbed this the way she absorbed most things, with the quiet intake of someone adding new information to a calculation that is already in progress, not beginning one. He sent them during daylight, before the storm got bad enough to cover the tracks. A pause. He wanted you to find them. Caleb looked at her. He hadn't arrived at that yet, and she was already past it. Crawford Dent doesn't threaten. She said it to the maps rather than to him. He informs. There's a difference. A threat is something you might or might not follow through on. And informing is something that has already happened and is simply being communicated after the fact. Her finger traced the boundary line of the Double D property. He's telling us he knows where she is. He's telling us he's measuring the situation before he commits. The wind had reached the kind of sustained pressure that found every gap in the walls and tested it. The fire threw moving shadows across the ceiling, and the two of them sat in the particular silence of people who have just received information they were already expecting. You know how to shoot, Caleb said. Not a question. He had seen the way she had handled the Winchester when she'd moved it off the table on the second day, not with the cautious of someone encountering a firearm, but with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has handled them enough that the basic mechanics no longer require conscious attention. My father believed that practical education included the means of protecting it. She said it without additional ceremony, because it didn't require any, a fact, not a boast. Caleb crossed to the east wall, took the Winchester down, and held it out. She took it with both hands, checked the action in the specific sequence that indicated someone had been taught correctly rather than self-taught, and held it at an angle that communicated she had already identified where she intended to be if what was coming arrived. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin with a sound like something that has been moving for a long time and has no intention of stopping. And under the wind, under the steady pressure of all that weather, the silence of a mountain that was keeping its own kind of record. Crawford Dent's men had come up through the snow to look at the cabin where his former wife was staying. They had taken their time. They had been careful. So would Caleb. He crossed to the door and checked the bar a second time, not because he doubted the first check, but because checking twice had kept him alive through conditions that checking once would not have been sufficient for. He returned to his chair by the fire and set the spare rifle across his knees and listened to the storm. Across the table, Ruth sat with the Winchester and the maps and the steady expression of a woman who had been living with danger long enough to have stopped being surprised by it and had moved into the more practical territory of being prepared for it. The fire burned. The snow came down. The horses were quiet in the lean-to, and the wind worked at the walls and somewhere down the mountain. In the direction of a white-painted house on the frozen valley floor, a man was almost certainly sitting in his own warm room thinking about tomorrow. Both of them knew it. Neither of them said so, because some things don't require saying, they require planning. And the planning was already underway. The second night of the storm, Caleb woke to sound from the loft. Quiet. The specific effort of quiet someone working to produce no sound at all, which is its own kind of sound, if you have spent enough years listening for the things that don't want to be heard. Underneath it, not quite contained, the uneven rhythm of someone crying without permission from themselves to cry. He lay still for 60 seconds. Listened to the fire he'd banked at midnight, still working in the hearth. Listened to the wind pressing its full weight against the north wall. Then he made his decision, which was not the decision of a man who couldn't hear what was happening above him, but the decision of a man who understood that some forms of pain require an audience only in the sense of requiring someone who will not interrupt. He did not climb the ladder. He got up from the chair, crossed to the hearth, and fed the fire until it was throwing real heat into the upper half of the room where the loft was. Then he sat back down and said to the ceiling, at a volume calibrated to carry upward, without demanding acknowledgement, "Bad dreams are just the mind catching up to what the body already came through." The sound from the loft stopped. Not all at once, over about 30 seconds, the way weather ends in stages, each quieter than the last. Several minutes passed. Then Ruth's feet appeared on the ladder rungs. The rest of her followed. She came and sat in the chair across from him without asking and without explaining, because neither asking nor explaining was what the moment required. They sat that way for the better part of 2 hours, both looking at the fire while the storm worked at the walls and the horses shifted somewhere in the lean-to, and the world outside reduced itself to wind and the occasional crack of timber under snow load. Eventually she said, "I dreamed he found me here. Except in the dream there was no one else." Caleb kept his eyes on the fire. He's a man with land and hired guns and money enough to make the law move slow. Same rules apply to him as to any man who decides he has rights he hasn't earned. A beat. When the shooting starts, he weighs the same as anyone else. Ruth turned and looked at him, and he felt the weight of both eyes, the green one and the gray one on the side of his face. "You were Union cavalry, 3rd Division, if I read the marking on that saddlebag correctly. What did you learn about men like Crawford Dent?" He was quiet for a moment that had genuine thought in it. Not arrangement, not performance. That the man who frightens you is loud in the approach. He wants the fear to do work before he has to. When the actual shooting starts, that noise stops. After that, it's just what's in front of you. He looked at her then. The mind gets loud before a fight. Then the first shot happens and the noise stops. Ruth looked back at the fire. He doesn't think he's frightening. That's the difference between him and a man who just gets angry. A man who knows he's doing wrong can at least be shamed into hiding it. Crawford Dent has an entire architecture in his mind that makes what he does feel like order being restored. He genuinely believes he's correcting something. That's what makes him harder to stop than a man who loses his temper. Caleb considered this with the attention it deserved because it was accurate in a way he hadn't arrived at from precisely that angle. She had lived inside that architecture for 14 months. She knew its load-bearing walls better than anyone standing outside it could. "Then we don't argue with the architecture," he said. "We remove it." Neither of them went back to the loft after that. They sat until the eastern sky differentiated itself from the surrounding darkness. The black grading toward a dark blue that meant the storm was spending itself. Ruth made coffee from a tin she'd found at the back of the supply cabinet, real coffee. Not the chicory substitute he'd been rationing since September. And they drank it in the gray early light, while the storm outside continued with diminished but unrepentant commitment. The storm finished on the 3rd morning, leaving 4 feet in the open clearing, and drifts up to 6 at the north corner, where the wind came around the granite shelf and lost its momentum. The high trail south was impassable and would remain so for the better part of a week. Whatever was below them in the valley was staying below them, and whatever was below them in the valley was fully aware of this. Caleb checked the trap lines on the 4th morning, the first day it was navigable, and came back with 3 beaver, and the information that the upper creek was still frozen solid, but showing stress fractures along the south-facing bank. Spring was not yet a fact, but it had become a possibility the world was beginning to entertain. Ruth was at the table when he returned, the lower valley section of the maps laid flat, her attention on the western edge of what he recognized as the Double D property boundary. She had drawn nothing on the maps, she understood, without being told that the maps were documents, not scratch paper, but her finger rested on a structure marked at the far western margin of the property, separated from the main house and bunkhouse by the full width of the main yard. the supply barn. She looked up when he came through the door and set the pelts on the west wall, and he could see she had been sitting with this for a while. He sent men during the storm, she said, which means he accepted the access risk specifically because the storm gave him cover. He wasn't waiting for conditions to improve. He was using conditions. Caleb took off his gloves and stood across the table from her. He wanted to know what he was walking into before he committed. And now he knows. Ruth's finger rested on the supply barn. He knows the cabin is defensible. He knows you're armed and that I'm not alone. He knows coming up the mountain in force is going to cost him something. A pause. So he'll wait for the moment that costs him the least. He'll choose the timing. He'll choose how many men, from which direction, in what weather. Every variable that matters is currently in his control. Her finger moved slightly on the map. This changes that. Caleb looked at what she was pointing at. The supply barn sat separated from the main structures by enough distance that a fire there wouldn't immediately threaten the bunkhouse or the main house, far enough to be its own problem, close enough to the western road to approach without going through the main yard. It held Crawford Dent's entire winter feed supply. Without it, he couldn't sustain his stock through February. He'd have to buy from the Carroll operation at the north end of the valley. Carroll charged a premium and hadn't kept a confidence in his life, so the transaction would be visible to everyone in the territory within a week. He'd have to pull men back from whatever he's planning up here to manage the logistics, Caleb said. Right now he decides when to move. He decides how many, from where, when we find out. Ruth looked up from the map. He should know it was us. He should have to stand in his valley and decide what story he tells about why the woman he sold at auction came down off the mountain and took something of his. The words carried something harder than anger, something that had been pressure for a long time, and had finally found its direction. He's been writing the story about me for 2 years. It's time the story had a different author. Caleb sat down across from her. He had spent his adult life making decisions under conditions that did not offer good options, only options, and he had learned over that time to distinguish between decisions made from clarity and decisions made from damage. This was not damage. This was a woman who had done the arithmetic between 14 months of one kind of life and 4 days of another, and had arrived at a clear answer through a process that had nothing impulsive in it. "We ride at dusk," he said. Ruth looked at him with both of her different-colored eyes, and what was in them was not recklessness and not cruelty and not the hot satisfaction of revenge being planned. It was the expression of someone completing a sentence they had been building for a long time and had only just found the words for. Yes, they rode south as the last light left the sky, the temperature dropping the way it drops at elevation when the sun clears the western ridge 20 degrees in 20 minutes, the cold arriving like a decision rather than a progression. Caleb on red, Ruth on dusty, both horses sure-footed on the crusted snow, moving through the lower pine forest at an angle that kept them off the main trail and within the shadow of the tree line. Ruth rode without instruction. She had been reading terrain her whole life through her father's maps, and she understood that the line on the paper corresponded to something navigable, and she selected the same lines Caleb would have chosen, avoiding the open saddles, where the moonlight would throw a silhouette against the white. He glanced back at her once. She was watching the trail. The scar on her left cheek caught the moonlight the way healed tissue does different relationship with light than the surrounding skin. The mark reading in the dark, as a record of something sustained rather than something survived. He looked at it, and felt the specific weight of a quiet anger he had not requested, and was not going to put down. The valley opened as they came through the last timber before the tree line broke onto the lower slopes. Double D Ranch spread across the frozen flat in a way that communicated its scale even in darkness. The main house, 2 windows lit on the ground floor, the long dark shape of the bunkhouse to the east, and at the western edge, separated from everything else by the width of the main yard, the supply barn dark, enormous, the repository of everything Crawford Dent needed to carry his operation through the winter. They left the horses in the tree line, with reins looped once around a pine branch. Enough to prevent wandering, not enough to trap them if something went wrong. Caleb checked the yard. No movement near the barn. The bunkhouse windows were lit, and the shadows behind them were the shadows of men keeping warm, attending their fire, not the darker shapes of men alert to the night outside. The main house showed one lamp at the far window, the kind left burning when someone is awake but occupied with something interior. They moved through the snow with the economy of people trained in different circumstances, by different teachers to move without waste. 20 yards from the barn, Caleb stopped and listened. The settling sounds of stored materials. Timber contracting in coal, no sound suggesting a human presence. He nodded once. Inside, the barn smelled of dry hay and machine oil and the deep, dusty sweetness of stored grain. Bales stacked 12 feet to the rafters. Barrels along the east wall holding corn and oats. Tack hanging in ordered rows along the south wall, the equipment of a working operation that had never had reason to consider its storage insecure. Everything Crawford Dent needed to run his ranch through February assembled in one location. Caleb put his hand on Ruth's arm. Not to stop her. Just present weight given to the moment before it changed. No going back after this. Ruth looked at him in the dark of the barn, both eyes holding whatever light was available. I've been past no going back for longer than you know. She drew a small tin lantern from inside her coat, struck the flint. The spark caught on the third stroke. The small flame threw a circle of warmth completely at odds with its purpose. She looked at the hay bales. She looked at the flame. And in her face was not cruelty and not the heat of something impulsive, but the expression of someone who has understood that absorbing an injustice without response is itself a choice, and who is choosing differently. She tipped the lantern into the base of the nearest bale. The fire took slowly at first, the way fire takes when it is learning the material, exploring the possibility of the thing before committing to it. Then the commitment arrived, and they were already moving back through the barn door, walking first, and then their pace accelerating as the orange light began showing through the barn's gaps and cracks, and the smell of burning hay reached the open air. From the bunkhouse, nothing yet. They were at the tree line before the first shout went up, then more shouting. The specific sound of men pulled from warmth into emergency, and the fire was fully audible now, the deep, consuming sound of something large giving itself over, and the light above the tree line painted the underside of the low clouds in copper. From the main house, a door. A figure on the porch. Crawford Dent came out without his hat, coat half on, and stood and looked at his barn burning. He did not run toward it, did not shout, did not produce any of the responses of a man caught by surprise. He stood and looked with the expression of someone receiving new information and updating his model of the situation in real time. Then he turned and looked toward the tree line. He could not have seen them. The distance was too great, the darkness between them complete, the fire behind him, destroying whatever night vision he might have had. But he turned and looked at the precise location where they stood. And Caleb would think about that moment in the days that followed, not that Dent had looked, but that he had looked at the right place. Ruth was watching beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the cold air. Her voice was low, he knows. Yes, good. And what she carried in that single word was not the hot satisfaction of a score settled, but something older and more settled than satisfaction. The sound of a sentence completed by the person it was about. They rode back up the mountain under a sky going clear as the storm finished its final business. Most of the climb passed in silence. Near the upper timber line where the trail leveled briefly before the last push to the cabin, Ruth let Dusty slow to a walk and Caleb let Red match the pace without comment. I hadn't laughed in almost 2 years, she said. Not performing it, just placing it in the cold air between them, the way you place something down when you've been carrying it too long. Not since before my father died. I'd forgotten it was something I did. Caleb didn't answer immediately because it wasn't a statement that needed an answer. It was an accounting. After a moment he said, "You'll have occasion." She looked at him with a faint expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite its absence. "You sound very certain of that." "I am," he said, and turned Red back toward the upper trail. 2 days passed without movement from the valley. Clean, cold days, the sky hard and blue and indifferent, the snow on the open slope so bright in the hours around midday that looking at it directly was its own problem. Caleb ran the trap lines. Ruth continued her systematic assessment of the supply situation and identified that the salt would last through February, and the coffee would not, a finding she delivered with the dry precision of someone who has decided that accuracy is more useful than comfort. On the second evening, she asked about the daguerreotype on the shelf. Not directly, she asked about the house in the image, a frame building Caleb didn't own anymore. He told her about the place outside of Sheridan he'd bought in 1868 and sold in 1873, because owning land you couldn't find a reason to stand on turned out to be a form of self-punishment rather than possession. And then Ruth waited, and Caleb understood what the waiting was for, and he told her about May, not the compressed version, the actual shape of it, the person first, before the ending. Because May had existed as a full human being before she existed as a loss, and he had spent 13 years reversing that order in his own memory, and he was tired of the reversal. May, who had been funny in the specific way of someone who sees the world clearly and refuses to be defeated by the seeing. May, who had believed in the ranch outside Sheridan, the way you believe in something you are actively building from raw material, with the full investment of someone who understands that partial commitment builds nothing. When he reached the winter of 71, he told it plainly. The fever, the 14-mile ride, the return 5 hours later. He had done everything available to a man in that situation, the full catalogue of what he was capable of, and it had amounted to not enough, and the distance between what he could do and what that situation required was the gap he had spent the subsequent years not looking directly at. Ruth listened without filling any of the silences. When he finished, she said, "The man who came down the mountain for flour and walked up to an auction block instead. That wasn't a stranger doing a kind thing. That was someone who recognized being made to stand still while something wrong happened in front of him." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "I know the difference between a man doing a generous thing and a man who physically cannot make himself look away. You were the second kind." He sat with that for a while. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what it did, cold and clear and enormous and entirely indifferent to the things happening inside the cabin. The fire was doing what it did. And for the first time in a time he wasn't going to count, the silence in the room did not feel like the silence of one person. The attack came on the third night after the barn. Not impulsive, not the hot response of a man who had just watched his winter feed supply burn. 2 days of pause, which Caleb understood in retrospect had not been hesitation but assembly. Crawford Dent did not move on anger. He moved on decisions. The 2-day gap had been him gathering his resources and confirming his information and selecting his approach. And what arrived on that third night was the result of all that assembly, which meant it was worse than anger would have been. It began with fire. A burning torch arced out of the dark and struck the lean-to roof while Caleb was at the woodpile, and the dry overhang caught before he had covered half the distance to the water barrel. He shouted for Ruth, while his hands were already moving toward the nearest bucket, and she was through the cabin door with the second bucket before the first rider came around the north corner of the clearing, at a hard gallop. 5 men, moving from 3 different angles with the coordination of people who had walked this ground in daylight and knew where every shadow fell. Not the number of men sent to intimidate, the number sent to conclude something. And in the center of the clearing, not mounted, standing on the ground with his coat open, despite the cold and his arms at his sides, Crawford Dent. The same posture he had held on his porch watching his barn burn. The patience of a man, observing the arrival of a result he has already calculated. His voice carried across the cold air at a volume that had never needed to be raised to carry Ruth. "Come home. This is already more than it needs to be." Ruth was at the lean-to with the second bucket, and the fire on the overhang was losing ground when the first shot from the north rider punched through the cabin wall, and Caleb moved before the gap between perception and action could open. The way years of training replaced deliberation under pressure, the way the body commits to the next thing before the mind has finished authorizing it. The north rider's horse screamed and bolted, and the rider went with it into the dark, which removed one variable from the count. Caleb caught Ruth's arm, and they went through the cabin door, and he barred it, and the second shot came through the window, and the third hit the door, and the fourth hit the wall to the left of the fireplace, and he heard it pass through the log and come to rest somewhere in the interior, with a sound like a hammer striking green wood. Ruth was loading with the speed of someone whose hands had been doing this long enough that the mechanism required no attention from the conscious parts of the mind. She moved to the east wall, the angle she had identified on her first evening in the cabin, that covered both the rear door and the east window simultaneously, the position she had noted and not mentioned, and clearly had not stopped noting. She said, They'll come through the front and the rear at the same time. Not a question, a reading. Yes, the front door came in on the second heavy blow. A large man moving through the smoke and noise with his shoulders across the frame. And Caleb put him on the floor with the rifle stock before the man had fully oriented to the interior. A second man behind him caught the door frame, and the collision brought 3 seconds of confusion that should not have worked but did. And from the rear of the cabin Ruth's rifle spoke once, and then there was a silence from that direction that answered the question of the rear door permanently. Through the broken front door Caleb could see the yard. 2 riderless horses at the clearing's edge. One man holding his arm at an angle that explained the riderless horses, and Crawford Dent standing exactly where he had been standing, in the same posture, with the same expression, except it wasn't quite the same expression. Something had changed in it, not anger, not surprise exactly, something more precise than either. The expression of a man whose model of a situation has been revised by data he had not factored into the original calculation. He had planned around resistance. He had not planned around this specific shape of it, what Ruth had become, or what she had always been, and he had failed to accurately measure. Dent raised his rifle. Caleb moved left. 2 shots in the span of a single breath, which at this range and this angle was not the comfortable margin it sounds like. Caleb felt the second one, the burn of it crossing his right hip, not the stopping impact of a vital hit, but the precise hot information of a wound that was real and would need accounting for. He staggered 1 step and stayed upright, because the mathematics of staying upright were simple enough. The only category worse than this one was the other one, and he was not entering it tonight. Dent's left shoulder had a new relationship with the situation. He was on one knee in the snow, his rifle somewhere in the yard beyond his reach, his right hand moving toward his holster with the determination of a man who has not yet accepted the terms being offered him. His eyes found Ruth. She stepped out from beside Caleb's left shoulder. She moved without hurry, the unhurried movement of someone who has arrived at a decision through a long process and is completing its final step. She lifted the Winchester and both of her eyes were level on Crawford Dent, the green one and the gray one, and Dent looked up at her from his knee, and in his expression was something Caleb had not expected to find there. Recognition. Not of Ruth as he had always categorized her. Recognition of something his model of her had not contained. Something that had not existed in his architecture of what she was. Her voice carried no heat and no performance. You put your mark on my face to make certain no man would ever want to look at me again. A pause that had the weight of everything that had happened in the time between that morning and this one. You were wrong about that. The words came out of a stillness that was not coldness, but its opposite, something so fully inhabited that it had no room left for anything that wasn't true. And you were wrong about something else. Dent looked at her. Whatever he had expected, it was not this. What? I was never yours to mark. She fired. Crawford Dent went down into the snow and stayed there. The remaining riders 2, possibly 3. Would you treat them with kindness? Caleb couldn't be precise in the dark, and the adrenaline of the preceding minutes turned for the tree line without further communication between themselves or with the man on the ground, because there was nothing left to communicate about. The sound of their departure diminished into the pine timber. The cold absorbed it, and then there was only the wind and the creek somewhere under its ice, and the fire in the cabin still burning through the open door. The clearing was quiet in the specific way a space goes quiet after gunfire and before the full weight of what just happened arrives. Ruth walked into the yard. She walked to where Dent lay, and she stood over him, and Caleb stood in the broken doorway and did not speak and did not move because this was not his moment to occupy. It had never been his moment. He had been a presence alongside someone else's most necessary reckoning, and he understood the difference between that and being the cause of it, and he honored the difference. She stood there until the snow had accumulated on the shoulders of her coat. Long enough for the sounds of the mountain night to settle back into their regular positions. Whined in the high timber, the creek working under its ice, the horses moving in the damaged lean-to. When she finally turned, her face carried something that had been at high pressure for a very long time and had been released at great cost and through great effort, and the expression of it was not triumph and was not grief, but something between the two that doesn't have a clean name. She crossed to where he stood. Let me look at your hip. Its surface. I'll make that determination. She moved past him into the cabin and found the clean cloth on the reorganized supply shelf in the location she had moved it to 3 weeks ago and knew precisely without looking. She came back to the doorway where the firelight was better and examined the wound with the focused calm of someone who has been making decisions under pressure and has not yet finished making them. It was surface. She was right to look. Both of these things were simultaneously true. While she worked, the night settled into its final register. Caleb looked at the broken window, the splintered door frame, the marks in the snow that were the record of the evening. Spring would bring official questions. The law moved slow in the territory, but it moved, and a dead man with significant property holdings would move it faster than most. Ruth tied off the bandage. Her hands were steady with the steadiness of someone who has used everything they have and found it sufficient. The only story that holds up is the true one. 5 armed men came to this cabin in the middle of the night. The walls have the record of it. The snow has the record of it. She looked at him directly. Anyone who wants to argue with that is welcome to come up here and read the evidence. Caleb looked at her at the face that had been marked to end something, and had instead marked the beginning of something. Your father taught you well, and what moved through her expression then was not gratitude and not its absence, but the look of someone who has been seen accurately, which is a rarer thing than simply being seen. He taught me that the truth was the only position worth holding, she said, because it's the only one you don't have to keep correcting. Outside, the thin snow continued to fall. The mountain stood in it. The creek ran under its ice. And inside the cabin, 2 people who had come through something together that had no clean name sat in the diminished firelight and did the practical work of attending to what needed attending to, which was its own kind of answer to the question the night had asked. Caleb went out to check the lean-to in the dark. The horses needed settling after the noise and the smell of a fire. The overhang had taken damage, but the framing had held, the bucket work having contained the fire before it reached anything structural. He stood in the lean-to doorway afterward and looked up at the sky above the mountain. At this elevation, on a clearing night, the stars accumulate in a way that is not metaphorical. Every one of them visible at once, the full catalogue of distance, the kind of sky that tells you simultaneously how large everything is and how small, and doesn't offer any comfort about which way to hold that information. Ruth appeared in the doorway behind him. He hadn't heard her come out. I thought I knew what it would feel like, she said. He waited. It doesn't feel like I expected. She was looking at the sky with the same attention she gave the maps, reading it for information. It feels like the first honest breath in a long time. Is that wrong? He looked at the stars. He thought about the things that feel wrong when they feel right, and the things that feel right because they actually are. No, he said. It feels like what it is, not what someone else decided it should be. She looked at him for a moment that had real weight to it, not the weight of resolution or arrival, but the weight of 2 people who have come through something together and found, on the other side of it, that the other person is still there. Then she went inside to put more wood on the fire. Caleb stood in the lean-to a moment longer. He looked at the tracks in the snow entry. Movement, departure, the record of an evening that had opened as one kind of story and closed as a different one. He thought about a man who had stood at the edge of something he couldn't stop, and what that standing had cost. He thought about the distance between being present for something and being able to change it, and about how sometimes the only act that matters is not leaving, which sounds like very little until you are standing in the cold outside a damaged lean-to on a Wyoming mountain at 2 in the morning, considering what the alternative would have looked like. It was not nothing. In the accounting that mattered, it was a great deal more than that. He went back inside. The valley below the Big Horn Range had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Not the quiet of a place conducting its regular business below the threshold of audibility, the quiet of a place that has paused to see how something resolves before continuing. Caleb felt it the way Red felt approaching weather. Without evidence he could arrange into a logical argument, but with the certainty of long familiarity with what a particular stillness meant. Crawford Dent had been dead for 8 days. In those 8 days, Caleb had done the work available to him. He had repaired the front door with boards from the wood stack, fitting them tight against the frame with the attention of a man who understood that gaps in walls were not metaphors but practical failures with practical consequences. He had replaced the broken window glass with oiled parchment stretched over the frame, not permanent, functional, which was the distinction that mattered through a Wyoming winter. He had inventoried what remained of the supply situation and confirmed what Ruth had already calculated. The flour was gone, the salt was down to a week, and the coffee had been gone since before any of this started. His hip had knit on a schedule faster than the wound's depth had suggested. The thigh from the war had ached in cold weather for 20 years, and this new one would do the same, which meant he was collecting a catalogue of old pains that would remind him of specific winters for the rest of his life. He had decided this was preferable to the alternative. Ruth changed the dressing each morning without discussion, because discussion was not what the task required. She had a way of doing necessary things that stripped them of any performance of care, not cold, but efficient in the way of someone who has decided that doing the thing correctly is the fullest expression of caring about it. He had stopped anticipating that this would change. It was simply how she was, and he had begun to understand that how she was had not been produced by the last 2 years, but had survived them, which was a different and more significant thing. On the morning of the 9th day, he told her he was riding down to River Fork Trading Post. She told him she was coming. He said the trail was manageable alone. She looked at him with the expression she used for statements that were structurally accurate and practically wrong. We face things together now, not a negotiation, a fact that had already happened and was simply being communicated after the fact, which was, he recognized, exactly the kind of sentence Crawford Dent used to use, and the recognition of that made him understand something about how language carried power regardless of who wielded it, and how different the same grammatical construction could feel depending on what it was built on. He did not argue. He had been operating on his own authority for 13 years, and had found it sufficient, and was finding, with increasing frequency, that sufficiency was a lower standard than he had previously considered it. They rode down together on a morning that had gone clear and hard, the cold working in a dry way rather than the wet cold that got into the joints. River Fork Trading Post was a low building that had accumulated function over 40 years the way buildings do when they occupy useful ground, a wall here, a lean-to there, a second room nobody had formally designated, but everyone used for receiving mail that had traveled from the territorial seat by wagon and needed somewhere to land. Ned Fitch was behind the counter when they came in, and 3 men Caleb did not recognize were at the far end of the room. Long coats maintained as a professional matter rather than a personal one. Boots that had been cleaned recently and would be cleaned again. The tallest of the 3 had the face of a man who had been handed complicated situations long enough that his default expression had become a kind of neutral readiness, not blank, prepared. He turned when Caleb and Ruth came through the door with the timing of someone who had heard them on the porch and made a decision about how to receive them before they arrived. Caleb Marsh, flat. Identification rather than greeting. Caleb said, "Depends who's asking." The man removed his hat, professional courtesy. The kind that says, "I am not trying to obscure my face from you." Ira Colton, Territorial Marshal's Division. His eyes moved to Ruth with the brief systematic attention of a man cataloging facts in sequence. "We're here regarding Crawford Dent." Fitch discovered something on the shelf behind him that required his complete attention. "What about him?" Caleb said. Colton arranged the facts without inflection. Dent found dead on Double D property. Witnesses placing Caleb and Ruth near the property the night the supply barn burned. The investigation open and requiring testimony. Ruth stepped forward, not ahead of Caleb, beside him, a movement so small and precise it communicated everything without announcing it. Her voice had the quality of something that had been prepared for this specific conversation, and had concluded that preparation was best expressed as directness. "He came to our cabin with 5 armed men. He fired first. I fired to stop him from killing Mr. Marsh." Colton looked at her for a moment past what simple information receipt required. He was reading the scar on her left cheek with the attention of a man who has been building a case in his professional ledger and is now confirming that the physical evidence aligns with the account taking shape there. "You have proof of entry and first fire, Caleb. The bullet holes in my walls aren't going anywhere before spring." Colton looked at his 2 deputies. One offered the fractional shrug of a man who has heard a logistically reasonable statement. Colton looked back at both of them with the expression of someone about to deliver information that is not a threat but will function as one regardless of intention. Dent has a brother. He turned his gloves once in his hands. Roland Dent. Operates cattle near the Colorado border. He's posted a reward. A pause that was professionally calibrated. $500 for the woman who killed Crawford. The number settled into the room. Colton raised one hand before either of them could speak. My office doesn't collect bounties, but the men who do collect them don't work by my code. And $500 motivates a specific professional class that has no interest in territorial court rulings or self-defense findings. He looked at Ruth directly, the look of a man formally acknowledging something he cannot formally acknowledge. I need 10 weeks to build a ruling that holds. In those 10 weeks, men who aren't me may come up the mountain. Caleb, when do you need to see the cabin? Something moved at the corner of Colton's mouth that was not quite a smile. Tomorrow at 8. I didn't particularly like Crawford Dent, but the law doesn't adjust for personal feelings on either side. He nodded once at Ruth in the manner of acknowledging something he could not put in his ledger, and then he left. His deputies behind him, the door closing on the cold. Fitch sold Caleb flour and salt at standard rate and asked nothing, which was the precise level of civic engagement Caleb had always valued most in a neighbor. The ride back carried different weight than the ride down. Same sky, same horses, same trail, but the silence between them had shifted from the working quiet they had built over weeks into something with more density, the weight of a formal process with a defined timeline and named risks attached to every week of it. Ruth said, 10 weeks. 10 weeks, Caleb said. She looked at the trail. Someone will come before that. More than one, probably. 500 draws professionals. A silence. Then you could tell Colton you acted alone, that I wasn't present for the shooting. That would be a lie, I know. Then I'm not telling it. She didn't push further. Whatever she had been testing with the suggestion, his willingness to absorb the legal exposure, or his commitment to the particular truth they had both agreed, was the only ground worth standing on. She had her answer, and it was the answer she had expected rather than merely hoped for, which told him something about how she had learned to measure men and what that learning had cost her. Colton arrived the following morning with one deputy and a ledger, and spent 4 hours in and around the cabin with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has understood that his documentation will be challenged by someone with significant resources, and who has responded to that knowledge by deciding to be more thorough than the challenge. He measured the bullet holes. He mapped their trajectories relative to the doorframe and window openings. He counted the expelled casings Caleb had swept to the sidewall and recorded the count. He pressed through the surface crust of snow in the yard to photograph the blood evidence that had preserved itself in the cold beneath the new accumulation. He did not speak to Ruth beyond what his formal work required, but he looked at her scar twice during those 4 hours, once when he believed she was looking elsewhere, and she was not. Once directly, at the end of the morning when he was closing his ledger, and this time he held the look long enough to he was choosing to see it as evidence in its complete context, rather than an isolated technical detail. Dr. Emmett Ward, Colton said, north end of Main Street in Garrett's Crossing. 15 years of professional record and a reputation for accuracy that has held up in territorial court 3 times. He settled his hat. If he examined this wound and provided a formal opinion regarding its nature and origin, that opinion would become part of the territorial record. Ruth understood this was not a suggestion. I'll ride down. Colton nodded and left. She made the ride to Garrett's Crossing 2 days later, on a morning cold enough to make the lower trail passable but not punishing. Ward had an office above the hardware supply, with a separate entrance, a deliberate arrangement, Caleb suspected, for consultations that required privacy. Ward was methodical in his late 50s. The kind of doctor who had understood early that his professional opinions carried consequences beyond his office, and who had responded by becoming as precise as his training allowed. He wrote 4 sentences. Ruth came back with a copy held in both hands as though it had physical weight, which it did. 4 sentences in the language of medicine that said what had been done to her, in the language of deliberate cruelty, and that would now exist in a record that could not be rewritten by money or influence, the way every other record in her life had been rewritten for 2 years. The weeks of waiting had their own structure. Week 1, Colton's documentation. Week 2, Ruth's visit to Ward, and then a second trip to confirm with Colton that the investigation was tracking its stated course. Week 3, quiet, the kind that followed major violence and preceded its official resolution. The valley below conducting its business with the muffled quality of a place, aware that something is still unfinished above it. Week 4 was when the bounty hunters came. Not on the mountain trail, where Caleb would have had the terrain in his favor. They came at the north trapline, near the ridge saddle, which meant they had watched the cabin's daily patterns for at least 3 days before committing, had identified that Caleb ran the north line alone in the mornings, and had positioned themselves accordingly. 2 of them, professional, which was what $500 bought, not angry men acting on impulse, but men who had done this before and had calculated the approach. 2 shots from positions he had not anticipated, which was itself information. They were good. Caleb was behind a fallen pine with a wound in his left thigh not deep, a through shot that had taken muscle rather than bone, bleeding steadily rather than catastrophically when he heard Dusty moving through the upper timber at a pace that the terrain at that elevation did not encourage. Ruth had heard the shots from the cabin. She had not waited. She came through the last stand of lodgepole, reading the situation as she rode Caleb's position, the 2 shooter locations, the angle of incoming fire. She did not come to him first. She dropped the reins ground-tied and moved east through the brush at the clearing's edge, low and fast, using the terrain the way someone uses it who has been reading topographic maps since childhood, and understands that the contour line on paper corresponds to something real that a person can move through. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Weeks 5 through 9 passed in the specific quiet of a process that is moving forward below the threshold of the visible. Colton sent word through Fitch at River Fork that the documentation was complete and filed. Ruth made one more trip down to confirm with Ward that his written opinion had been formally submitted to the Territorial Record Office, which it had. The valley below went about its business. Cattle moved. Smoke rose from the Double D bunkhouse. The world continued in the way worlds continue when they are waiting for an official determination before deciding what to do next. Caleb ran his trap lines. Ruth reorganized the supply shelf a second time, according to a logic he still couldn't fully decode and had stopped trying to. They cooked together in the evenings according to a rhythm that had established itself without either of them designing it. He read from the shelf of books. She read the maps. Some nights they talked and some nights they didn't, and both kinds of nights had become equally habitable, which was itself a form of information about where they had arrived. The 10th week arrived with a letter from Colton. The hearing was set. February 14th. Garrett's Crossing Town Council Hall. Both parties required to appear. Ruth folded the letter and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have been moving toward for a long time and have now arrived at. Then she stood and crossed to the window and looked at the valley below and said nothing, which was its own form of answer to the question neither of them had asked aloud. It was in the days before the hearing that the bounty hunters came. The first hunter, behind a boulder at the clearing's far edge, was fully committed to watching Caleb behind the log. His partner had a compromised right shoulder. Ruth's work on her approach, Caleb realized afterward during the interval, when he had heard nothing and assumed nothing was yet happening. The man behind the boulder stepped out of cover because he had decided the moment was available, because he believed he had a complete picture of the clearing and everyone in it. Ruth came up behind him from the eastern brush. "Turn around." He turned. She put the rifle stock across his temple with the precise force of someone who has calculated what the situation requires and applied exactly that. He went down into the snow with the finality of a significant miscalculation. The second hunter looked at his partner on the ground, looked at Ruth, assessed his one functional arm. The arithmetic had one direction. He ran for the tree line, and the timber absorbed the sound of him. Ruth crossed to Caleb and pressed both hands against the wound without preamble. No words, no assessment announced aloud, just the immediate competent action of someone who has moved the most urgent item to the top of the list. He looked at her hands on his leg and then at her face and said, "You came up alone." She didn't look up. "You were alone out here." "That's not the same." "It's the same." Her hands kept the pressure even. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Would you treat them with kindness?" She helped him up with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who is stronger than she appears, and has known this long enough that it requires no acknowledgement from either of them. They got him onto Red, who stood with the uncharacteristic stillness horses, sometimes find when the situation around them has exceeded their normal register, and they have elected simply to be useful. Ruth rode close on the way down, near enough to catch him if the leg renegotiated their arrangement on the trail. In the cabin, she cleaned the wound with water boiled on the stove and packed it correctly, and when she was done, she sat across from him at the table and looked at him with both of her differently colored eyes in the firelight, and what was in them was not the relief of crisis survived but the harder, more settled quality of someone who has moved through danger enough times that surviving it has stopped being surprising and has become simply the next thing to work with. Ward's report, she said. Colton's documentation. The evidence in the walls. She looked at the repaired door frame, the patched window. When this goes to the hearing, every person in that room is going to have to look at what actually happened and decide whether to call it something else. A pause that had the weight of everything she had been carrying since before he bought her off a wagon. I want to be the one who says it first. He looked at her across the table. You will be. She held his gaze for a moment that had genuine length. Then she got up and put more wood on the fire, and the night settled around the cabin in the way nights settle when the immediate danger is past, and what remains is the waiting, which is its own kind of difficult. On a night in the third week of December, rain came, the first rain of a Wyoming winter that had lost its confidence about what form precipitation should take, tapping against the roof in a minor key while Caleb lay on the cot cataloging the thigh's progress. The wound was doing what wounds do when they are not going to cause additional problems, closing from the inside out. The muscle reknitting with the slow reliability of tissue that has not been asked to do anything beyond what tissue does. Ruth was in the chair by the fire, not sleeping. Watching the door with the rifle across her knees, the posture of someone who has made a decision about what the present moment requires and is committed to it without complaint. He said, "You could ride to the territorial seat. Get a lawyer to establish your legal standing as Dent's widow. Take what the estate owes you by law and start over somewhere east where nobody knows your name." She let the suggestion exist in the air for a moment. Long enough to show she was considering it, and not long enough to suggest she was tempted. "I don't want somewhere nobody knows my face." Her voice was even and final, the way a door is final when it has been closed by someone who has thought about whether to close it. "I want somewhere someone sees it." He reached out and took her hand across the space between them, deliberate, unhurried, with the full weight of knowing what the gesture meant, and without trying to make it mean anything beyond what it was. She let him hold it and did not add to the moment and did not subtract from it. Outside, the rain continued in its uncertain way, neither committing to winter nor releasing it. The mountain above them did what it had always done, which was to continue, and the continuity of it was not comfort exactly, but it was honest, and honesty was the thing that had mattered most to both of them for longer than either had found a way to say. The 14th of February arrived cold and clear, which felt like either providence or coincidence depending on how you held the relationship between significant events and atmospheric conditions. Caleb saddled both horses before first light. Ruth came out of the cabin in her good coat, dark wool, well maintained through everything, preserved at the bottom of her pack with the care of someone who had known she might need it for exactly this kind of morning. Her hair was arranged. The scar on her left cheek was where it had always been, and she was making no adjustment for it in any direction. They rode into Garrett's Crossing at 7. The main street was unchanged in its physical facts, same wood frame buildings, same coal smoke, same frozen mud in the configurations it had taken all winter. The specific unchanged geography of a place that had been the site of the worst morning of Ruth Hadley's recent life, and was now also going to be the site of something else. Both of those things true simultaneously in the record of the same ground. People on the boardwalk stopped. Not with hostility and not with welcome, with the suspended attention of a community that has been waiting to find out what it thinks about something before committing to an expression. Ruth rode without adjusting her pace or her posture or the direction of her gaze. She looked forward and she met the eyes of the people who looked at her with the composure of someone who has understood that what she is does not require negotiation with any audience, and has understood this deeply enough that it no longer costs her anything to act on it. Caleb watched from his peripheral vision and said nothing, because every decision that mattered had already been made before they reached the edge of town. The town council hall was the largest interior space in Garrett's Crossing that wasn't a church or a saloon. Long benches filled the main floor. At the front, a raised platform with a table. Ira Colton at the table with his ledger open. The posture of a man who has done this enough times to have a specific physical relationship with the chair and the table and the particular weight of what is about to happen. To his left, a man in a suit that had been purchased somewhere that took suits seriously, Aldous Crane, Roland Dent's attorney from Denver, his presence communicating precisely how much money was being deployed against Ruth's account of events. And to Crane's left, Roland Dent himself, broader through the chest than his brother had been, with the specific look of a man who has traveled far and spent significantly to arrive at a result he considers both righteous and inevitable. Every bench was full. Standing room along the walls taken. Caleb recognized faces. Ned Fitch from River Fork, watching with the careful neutrality of a man determining which direction a situation is going to fall. Silas Bowman near the back, wearing the expression of a man who has been hoping that civic invisibility is a viable long-term strategy and is arriving at a different conclusion. And in the third row on the left side, the woman who had been at the front of the crowd at the auction, the one who had turned away. She looked at Ruth when Ruth walked in. Then she looked at the floor. Crane presented his case with the polished confidence of a man hired for his ability to make a selection of facts sound like a complete account of events. 3 points developed with skill. Ruth's documented history of instability as recorded in Crawford Dent's own papers. The suspicious nature of a woman who had abandoned legal marriage to take up residence with an unrelated man. The calculated character of the supply barn attack as evidence of premeditation that undermined any claim of subsequent defensive action. He was good at what he did. The sequence he constructed had internal coherence, if you had not been on the mountain. Colton let Crane finish entirely. Then he called Silas Bowman to the front of the room. Bowman made the walk from the back bench to the platform, with the body language of a man who has spent months hoping that civic invisibility was achievable, and is learning in real time that it was not. Colton walked him through the auction with the methodical patience of a man who knows exactly what each question will produce and is asking it for the record rather than for information. The rope, the grain sack, the bidding, the terms under which the sale was conducted. Bowman answered in the compressed syllables of someone attempting to be technically accurate without being morally present, and every person in the room heard every word of it. And the quality of attention in the room changed in a way that was neither loud nor subtle. Colton called Dr. Emmett Ward. Ward's testimony lasted 4 minutes and used precise professional language to say 2 things. The scar on Ruth Hadley's left cheek had been produced by a sharp instrument drawn with controlled deliberate force, consistent with intentional application rather than the irregular wound pattern associated with accidents or mutual struggle. And the geometry of the mark was consistent with an act of sustained purposeful intention, rather than any form of impulsive violence. He said both things without elaboration because neither required any. He had written 4 sentences and he read 4 sentences and he sat down. Crane objected twice. Colton noted both objections, paused, and continued. Ruth Hadley. She stood, she walked to the front of the room and turned to face it. And for a moment, the only sounds were the fire in the corner stuff and the muffled noise of the street coming through the walls, and the held breath of a room that had been assembled specifically for this. She spoke for 8 minutes. Not with performance and not without feeling, with the flat carrying accuracy of someone who has decided that the facts in their sequence are sufficient and require nothing added to them. She described the night Crawford Dent died the same way she had described it to Colton at the trading post. Location, timeline, the sequence of the attack, her responses, the outcome. When she reached the moment Dent came through the broken door, she did not slow down or speed up or change the register of her voice in any direction. It carried to every corner of the room without being raised. He was not there to negotiate. He came with 5 armed men to a private home in the middle of the night. Mr. Marsh had already been shot. The man who had stood in my kitchen 2 years earlier and cut my face while I held still was standing 6 feet in front of me and reaching for his pistol. A pause that contained everything that had happened between that morning and this one, compressed into the silence between 2 sentences. I fired, because the only alternative was to watch him finish what he had started. The room held. Crane said. The witness provides an account with no independent corroboration. Colton did not raise his voice. He did not need to raise his voice, and he appeared to understand this with the completeness of a man who has never needed to. The bullet holes in the cabin wall are corroborating. The 5 sets of horse tracks documented in my survey are corroborating. The expelled casings from 5 distinct firearms recovered at the site are corroborating. The physician's formal assessment of the wound on Mrs. Hadley's face is corroborating. The testimony of the auction operator regarding the conditions under which she was sold is corroborating. He looked at Crane with the expression of a man who has laid everything he has on the table and is waiting to see what the other man has. Do you have physical evidence that contradicts any specific item in my documented record? Crane looked at his papers. His papers did not contain physical evidence that contradicted any specific item in the documented record. Roland Dent said something to Crane. Crane said something back. The quality of that exchange was the quality of 2 men calculating whether a position is worth the continued cost of defending it, when that cost is becoming visible to everyone in the room. The death of Crawford Dent, on the night of the 22nd of November, 1884, is ruled justifiable self-defense under territorial law, Colton said. This matter is closed to further proceeding in this jurisdiction. He closed his ledger with the finality of a man who has done the work he came to do and is finished doing it. Mr. Dent, you are welcome to pursue this in federal jurisdiction at your own expense. My complete documentation will be available to both parties. Roland Dent stood up. He was a large man, and standing made him larger. And he pointed at Ruth with the concentrated anger of someone who has traveled a long distance and spent significant money to arrive at a result he cannot accept. He said something about justice, something about his brother, something about money and influence that were supposed to have produced a different outcome, and had not. Ruth turned and looked at him. She did not speak. She turned and looked at Roland Dent with both of her differently colored eyes, and she held his gaze without adjustment of any kind, not flinching, not hardening, not performing anything. Simply present, fully present, the complete fact of her, standing in that room, looking at him with the undivided attention of someone who has decided that what she is does not require the approval or the anger or the grief of the man in front of her to remain true. 10 seconds, maybe 12. Roland Dent stopped speaking. Not because she had argued with him, she had said nothing. Not because someone had interrupted, no one had. He stopped because the performance required an audience willing to treat it as something other than a performance, and she was not that audience. And he had run out of other options. There is a silence that cannot be argued with. Ruth Hadley had been building it for most of her adult life. She had simply found, at last, the room where it carried its full weight. They walked out of the town council hall into February afternoon light that had decided provisionally to be warmer than the morning. The main street was the same main street, same buildings, same frozen mud, same coal smoke, but now the street held 2 different mornings in its record rather than one, and that was a fact that could not be revised regardless of what anyone in Garrett's Crossing decided to say about it afterward. The woman from the 3rd row was standing near the dry goods store. She looked at Ruth with an expression that had not yet assembled itself into anything requiring a name, somewhere between recognition and the discomfort of recognition. The face of someone seeing clearly a thing they had previously chosen not to see clearly, and finding the clarity costs something. Ruth looked at her without stopping, without judgment and without comfort. The look of someone who sees what is present, notes it, and continues walking, because she has somewhere to be, and the woman by the dry goods store is not part of where she is going. Caleb said, "How are you?" Ruth considered it with the care she gave to questions that deserved an honest answer rather than a functional one, like a room that's been shut up a long time and someone finally opened the window. She looked at the street around them, the same geography it had always been, the same buildings, changed now only by what had happened inside one of them. It doesn't fix what happened. People in that room will go home and some of them will talk about it wrong, but I stood in there and I said what was true. And they had to sit in their seats and hear it. They heard it, Caleb said. Yes. Something settled in her face, not the release of tension, but the arrival of something that had been in transit for a long time and had finally reached the place it was going. They heard it. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon. the sun dropping behind the western ridge in the way it drops at this elevation in February, abrupt, the warmth going with it in minutes rather than degrees. The trail was familiar, in the specific way routes become familiar, when you have traveled them in enough different circumstances that each passage carries the weight of the previous ones. At the viewpoint where the south face opened onto the full extent of the valley below, Ruth stopped Dusty. She sat on the mare and looked at the valley in the last of the light. The Double D Ranch far below the white house dark now, the property taking on the look of something that had stopped mid-sentence and found no way back to one. Caleb stopped Red beside her, and they looked at it together without speaking. And the looking was its own form of completion, the acknowledgement of a thing that was finished. Spring came the way spring comes to Wyoming, not graciously, not in a straight line, but in argument with itself. One warm week followed by a week of cold, followed by a week warmer than the first. The snow pulling back up the slopes in increments, the creek finding its way through the ice from underneath, the sound of it reaching the cabin on still mornings. One evening in late May, Ruth was outside watching the first wildflowers along the creek bank press through the last of the cold mud. Caleb came out and stood beside her, and they were quiet together, the particular quiet of two people who have learned to be quiet together, which is different from the silence of one person, and different again from the silence of two people who don't know what to say to each other. She said, "You never asked me," he waited, "to stay. Through all of this, you never actually asked me to stay." The evening held its position around them, birds settling in the timber, the creek running clear over its stones, the last of the daylight going gold across the high granite above the tree line. Caleb turned to face her and took both of her hands in his, the hands of a man who had spent decades doing physical work, being used now with the care they were capable of when the moment called for it. "Ruth Hadley, will you stay? No courthouse, no paper if you'd rather not have paper, no preacher unless you want one. Just this mountain and that creek and whatever years are coming." She looked at his hands holding hers. She thought briefly about what she was comparing this to, and found the comparison took almost no time, because the things being compared occupied such different categories that placing them side by side required a significant effort of imagination. On one side, a transaction completed before she had understood its terms, in a house in a valley under the authority of a man who had confused ownership with relationship until he could no longer see the difference. On the other side, this, a man on a mountain in the last of the May light, asking rather than telling, waiting for her answer rather than assuming it. Yes. No courthouse, no paper, no witnesses except the pine trees and the running water, and the early stars coming out above the eastern ridge one at a time in the order they had always come out, indifferent and permanent, and exactly where they were supposed to be. Summer came in strong and useful, the kind that makes the preceding winter feel like something invested rather than merely endured. Caleb built another room onto the north side of the cabin, hand-hewn logs matching the original structure. Same steep pitch on the roof, same careful chinking between courses. Ruth designed the space on the back of one of the old topographic maps, a pencil sketch that was better than anything Caleb would have drawn on his own, and he said so without qualification because it was simply true. The room was finished by August and smelled of new pine and the clean resinous promise of recently worked wood. One morning in the last week of August, before Caleb had come down from the loft, Ruth was standing outside in the early light with her hand resting on her stomach. Not quite a gesture, not quite its absence. When he came out, she turned, and he read what was in her face before she said anything, the face of someone who has received news they had prepared for and finds it larger than the preparation fully accounted for. He stood with it for a moment that had real dimensions. In his face, and Ruth would think about this on many subsequent occasions, in the privacy of her own thoughts was an expression she had no single word for. Not relief, though relief was there. Not happiness exactly, though that was there too. Something older and more specific than either. The expression of a man who has been carrying a particular weight for a very long time, and has just been told, in terms he can trust completely, that he is allowed to set it down. He put his hands on her shoulders. She covered them with hers. They stood that way in the August morning while the creek ran, and the horses moved in the lean-to, and the mountains around them did what mountains do, which is to continue in their old indifferent permanence, not comfort, not cruelty. Just the honesty of things that exist on a scale that makes human timelines look like a single season in a long succession of seasons. In October, a letter arrived from the Garrett's Crossing Town Council, formal, sealed, written in the administrative language of territorial government completing its official work. Ruth read it at the table, read it to the end, folded it along its original creases, and held it in both hands for a moment. The way you hold something when you are deciding what it means rather than what it says. Caleb watched her from across the room. She stood and crossed to the shelf and opened the small wooden box she had placed her in the spring, in the weeks, when everything was still unresolved, and she had begun collecting the record of what was happening because she understood even then that the record would matter. Keep it, she said. She set the letter inside and closed the lid. She looked at Caleb across the room, both eyes open, the scar on her left cheek holding the lamplight the way it always held light, as part of the room rather than separate from it, a mark that had been made to end something and had ended nothing, that had instead marked the beginning of the longest and most necessary chapter of a life that was not finished and had never been broken. This is the record of who I am. The record of a woman who walked into the room where people had decided she didn't matter and said what was true until they had to hear it. Caleb looked at her from across everything they had come through together. She was. The first snow of the new season had started sometime in the previous hour, falling without opinion, settling into the pines and along the creek bank and onto the roof of the original cabin and the new room beside it. The lamp in the window pushed its light against the early dark, and inside, two people who had come through fire and courthouse and the long wait of winter sat together in the warmth of what they had built, and the life they were living continued in the way life continues when it is being lived without reservation, which is to say forward, and with the full weight of everything that had made it possible.